Well, hello there! Congratulations, you found this channel and this video. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you somewhat of a guide when shopping for lenses. So if you're a new photographer, this is a lot of great information. But if you're professional, you may not need to know about this. But it's always worth watching anyway. So we're going to be talking about what different types of lenses are, so what a millimeter is, what an f-stop is, and what scenarios you should use those in, as well as what lens you should buy first for your scenario. Before we do that, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Artlist. If you're a creative like myself on YouTube, or even have a large production company, you're going to need stock assets such as music, sound effects, and footage, and Artlist is the best place to get that. With different plans stemming from just music to Artlist Max with everything you need, Artlist is the place to go. If you want to get 2 months for free on your annual subscription, check out the link below. Thank you to Artlist for supporting the channel, and back to the video. First off, let's talk about what is a millimeter. So I've got two lenses here. One is a 50mm and one is a 16mm. They look the same and they're about the same price, but there's a lot different to them. So for example, with the 50mm, you can see in this clip right here, it's about a mid-zoom shot. So it's not super zoomed in, but it's not super wide. Now if we swap out to this 16mm, it's a lot wider, but the effective focal range depends on the type of sensor your camera has. So for example, a 50mm lens will be more like an 80mm lens when put on an APS-C camera. So that's just something to pay attention to. So if you have a full frame camera, 50mm is 50mm. But if you have a crop sensor camera or APS-C camera or micro four thirds camera, whatever it may be, make sure to multiply the zoom by the crop factor. Most cameras that are APS-C are 1.5 to 1.6 for reference. Now, how much zoom is too much? Well, as we talked about earlier, 50mm is a mid zoom and 16mm is wide. But there's a lot more to that. So, for example, I have here a 18mm to 35mm. Now, because this is for a smaller sensor, this is actually more like a 22 to a 45 or 50-ish. But before we move on, I want to explain something real fast. This lens is a zoom lens, but it's not a crazy zoom lens like you might think of it. This is a wide zoom lens versus this is a telephoto zoom lens. Zoom lenses are just lenses that can change their zoom ratio. For example, 18 to 35, or like this one, 150 to 600. It doesn't actually mean it has a lot of telephoto length to it. Versus other lenses like this 16mm or the 50mm we were talking about earlier, these are prime lenses. You can't zoom them in and out. So that's a quick example for you there. Let's move on. So that 18mm to 35 or 22 to 50-ish equivalent is going to be on the wide side of things. You would use a lens in these 16 to maybe 35 range for vlogging. So if you have a camera out in front of you, just like this, you're going to want to use a wider lens. Now again, make sure to pay attention to the crop factor of your camera, because a 16mm lens becomes a 24 if you have a smaller sensor. Okay, so wider lenses like 16, maybe 24 or 15mm are going to be wide lenses used for vlogging, maybe real estate photography or landscape photography. But your mid zooms like 50mm, 85, maybe 100mm are what you're going to use for portrait photography. Now the reason we want to use longer lenses for photography for people is because it looks better. If we have a super wide lens that's closer, it's going to distort the subject. So that's why we want a 50 to 100mm range for that. For example, right now I'm filming at about 150mm, which looks really awesome. But if I filmed at 16mm right here, it'll be all distorted. With portrait photography, you're going to want a little bit more zoom than you would want with vlogging or with real estate photography or wider applications like that. Now let's move on to the next section, which is
your mega zoom lenses.
For example, this 150 to 600mm lens. You can use these for sports photography. For example, if you want to go to a baseball game or a football game, you can use lenses like this guy. And this will give you all that zoom that you can basically look like you're on the field, but not actually be on the field. And 150 to 600mm is awesome for that. It's also great for wildlife. But here's the thing. Earlier when we were talking about that crop factor, it really starts to multiply here. So instead of 16mm becoming 22mm, it's now 600mm becomes 940mm. Basically, the more zoom you have, the bigger difference it can make. So if you're wanting to do a lot of sports photography or wildlife photography or basically anything with a giant lens, make sure to pay attention to that. It might be better to get a smaller sensor camera for that crazy zoom. So a smaller sensor might seem like a good idea for the zoom it offers, but there are some downsides to smaller sensors. The big one is because it's a smaller sensor, it's letting less light in, meaning you have to increase the ISO or lower the shutter speed. And this is going to result in worse photos overall, either noisier photos or blurrier photos. So that's something to pay attention to. It all depends on your situation. For most scenarios, full frame cameras are going to be the best option, but they're pretty expensive and APS-C cameras can be better in niche scenarios. For example, with wildlife. Okay, that's a quick overview. Now, let's talk about specific lenses. Now, we know that if we want to do vlogging or real estate photography, we want a wider setup. For example, 16 millimeters, 18 millimeters. And if we want to do portraits, maybe 50 to 100 millimeters, and then sports and wildlife, stuff like that, we want maybe 100 millimeters to 600 millimeters, even beyond that. But what are some specific lenses you can get? Well, this depends on the ecosystem you're in. For example, I'm in the Canon ecosystem, so I want to get RF lenses that are compatible with my RF cameras. But if you are using older Canon cameras, maybe you want EF lenses, or maybe if you're a Sony customer and you want Sony E-mount. So just a quick recommendation is the camera manufacturer is probably going to have awesome lenses for their cameras. For example, Canon's L-Glass is awesome with their Canon RF cameras, but they're pretty expensive. And again, the main thing to pay attention to when shopping for lenses is the focal range, so how wide or how zoomed it is, but the other thing is that we haven't talked about much is the f-stop. The f-stop determines how much light is let into the sensor. For example, a wide open lens like this 50mm has an f-stop of 1.8, where other lenses, like this kit lens that came with my Canon R7, are f3.5 to 6.3. It's a lot darker. Basically, without getting to a huge explanation of an f-stop, it is more light into the sensor. A lower number equals more light. So when shopping for lenses, pay attention to that millimeter count, which we talked about earlier, and the f-stop. The lower, the better. So if you want to buy a lens for your camera, for your Canon camera, you can buy a Canon L-Glass and it'll work awesome. If you want to buy a Sony G-Master lens for your Sony camera, that'll be awesome. You can do that across the board. But some scenarios, you might want to go third-party and get adapters or even third-party glass that supports the same mount as your camera. For my example here, I have a 150mm to 600mm lens for my Canon cameras. Now, this is the older mount, so it only works on the older cameras, not the newer ones. If I want to be able to use this ones on the newer ones, I have to get an adapter. Now, this is an adapter that Canon sells for their Canon systems, so it's easier to work from older to newer Canon lenses. But if you want to adapt from maybe Sony lenses to Canon, it's going to be a harder time, but it is possible. Depending on the type of lens you want, maybe it isn't available from the manufacturer of the camera, so maybe Canon doesn't make a lens like this one. Of course, there's a ton of different lenses and brands that you can choose from, but here are some quick recommendations if you're just a beginner photographer and don't know what you want. The first lens I would recommend is a 50mm f1.8 lens. It's going to be bright and it's going to be cheap. It's an all-around great lens for beginners, and I still use it today. Now, another lens to consider is maybe a 70 to 200mm. Now, again, depending on the type of photography you're doing, you may not want a zoom lens like that. You may want a wider lens, maybe a 15mm to 35mm. And if you don't know what type of lens you want, well, go back in the video and see what type of photography you want to do. Do you want to do wildlife photography or do you want to do portraits? It all depends. Again, depending on the type of brand you have, there will be different options available. But generally speaking, all lenses are going to be very similar depending on the brand. Some lenses offer additional features, maybe stabilization or water resistance, but if it's a good lens from a good manufacturer in any recent year, it's going to be pretty decent, especially if it's designed for your system. For example, again with the Canon L-Glass, if I get a Canon lens from Canon that matches my camera, it's going to be awesome, versus a cheaper older lens that maybe I have to use an adapter for and isn't ideal. Now, if you're a wildlife photographer or sports photographer, you're going to want all the range you can get. So a lens like this from Sigma, a 150mm to 600mm, is going to be awesome. Basically anywhere between that 300 to 600mm range is what you want for wildlife photography and for sports. Now, something to consider too is how bright the lens is, and that's what we talked about earlier, right? The brighter the lens, the lower the f number. So that's something to consider too. If you're a wildlife photographer and you want to get evening shots, you do not want an f11 lens. You want an f6 lens, an f4 lens. Overall, it all depends on the scenario you're in. So if you have any specific questions on any gear, let me know in the comment section down below. Also, in the description below, I'll have a bunch of recommendations for different systems and different lenses that I would recommend depending on what you want to do. They'll be organized by type. So if you're a wildlife photographer, or if you're a portrait photographer, or if you're a landscape photographer, they'll all be organized in the description below, and their affiliate links, go check them out if you want to. That's going to be it for today's video. If you want to help support the channel, please consider using the affiliate links that I just mentioned a minute ago, subscribe to the channel, or check out our sponsors, as well as follow me on any of the other platforms like Instagram, X, and you can even add the newly announced JMP podcast to wherever you get your podcasts. So that's going to be it for today's video, and I'll see you in the next video.